Hello and welcome to Zilog and Moto. If you aren't aware, my name is Dave and this is my channel. Yep, this is all me, so all the recording, writing, editing, gameplay footage, voiceovers, that is the responsibility of yours truly, and believe me, I greatly apologize in advance. On this channel I have a goal, and that goal is to collect complete copies of every English language game for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. But I think collecting just for the sake of collecting is silly, so I also have the goal of doing a deep dive into each of these games, including a look at the packaging of the game and the game footage from me playing the game, all compiled up into about a 20-minute or so review. So sit back, relax, maybe grab a frosty beverage from the fridge as we take a look back at the game of the week. This week, as you could probably tell from the title card, we'll be looking at a game for the Genesis from one of its key third-party vendors in Electronic Arts. And that game is LHX Attack Chopper. LHX Attack Chopper was released for the Genesis in November of 1992, just in time for the Christmas season that year. Because I know as a kid, I was all about the flight sim that involved experimental aircraft that didn't exist, flying around countries that I couldn't find on a map at the time, with control schemes that are probably too complicated for a 3-button controller, and 3D polygonal graphics that run at 1 frame per second. Now, if you couldn't tell, that last line was sarcasm. And to be totally fair to Electronic Arts, people do like different things. And it would be boring if all games were just made in the most popular genres, so there is definitely a place for a game like this in the Genesis library, with Electronic Arts even coming up with its short-lived EA Air Force branding for these types of games. I'm just not sure how many kids were out there clamoring to get this one for Christmas under the tree, that's all. In fact, many of the people that might have been interested in a title like LHX Attack Chopper might have already played it before its Genesis release, as, surprise surprise, it wasn't originally a Genesis game. No, LHX Attack Chopper's origins actually go back to an appearance on home computers with a MS-DOS release 2 years before, in 1990. This was pretty common for Electronic Arts back in the day, as before the Genesis became a thing, they were making their bread and butter on home computer releases. And we've previously talked about how many of their sports franchises made their debut on PCs rather than on consoles, like John Madden Football, Lakers vs. Celtics in the NBA playoffs, and PGA Tour Golf. But then there were other games as well that made that transition, like Populous and The Immortal. And yes, if you want to be technical, Populous debuted on the Amiga, and The Immortal debuted on the Apple II GS of all things. But the point is, they both were computer games before they were console games. Anyway, if you flash back a minute to my sarcastic description of LHX Attack Chopper, you might think, oh, he's not gonna like this. And that's possible, I'm not gonna lie, but I think it's a bit early to make that statement. I would point back to episode 86, where I reviewed another game in the EA Air Force series, F-22 Interceptor. F-22 Interceptor has a lot of similarities to LHX Attack Chopper, and if you didn't see that review, I'll sum it up with, I didn't hate it. It's not a game that I'll be rushing back to play, but it wasn't complete trash. And I'm hoping to have a similar experience with LHX Attack Chopper, but first, let's take a look at the package. And here's my copy of LHX Attack Chopper for the Genesis. As you can probably immediately see, this is not a museum-grade copy of the game. All over the outer cover there are numerous nicks and dings, and even a few gouges and pinholes, but ultimately it's done its job as a protective cover and actually protected the inner artwork well, which is perfectly intact with no water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear. These clamshells are one of the reasons why I enjoy collecting for the Sega consoles of the era, as the boxes that Nintendo used at the time, and later on Sega as well, are just flimsy. If one of those boxes took even a small amount of damage that this case has seen,
it would be completely trashed. And of course, that's part of the reason why some of those games, especially the third-party Super Nintendo games, are impossible to find boxed up. Looking past the scratches and dings, the front cover art uses the classic Electronic Arts half-and-half formatting to the cover, with the game designer credits to the inset and the side. There's a few little things to notice here, like the wireframe designs hiding behind the LHX artwork, and the top view that's drawn inside the LHX at the bottom, referencing the fact that the LHX was still very much in the design stages at this point. Also, you have EA's Air Force branding being literally front and center on the cover, sitting between the artwork of the LHX and the logo down below. Fun fact, I haven't gotten around to reviewing it yet, but originally Desert Strike was the other game in this series with F-22 Interceptor, despite it being an action game rather than a sim, and then of course the Strike series took over on its own outside the PC-based combat fighter genre. Ultimately, the cover art for the US version is similar to the Japanese version in design, with the Japanese version just getting more forest in the background and some Japanese text. But what's striking is the European version, which expanded the inset art to take up the whole cover, and I've got to say, I think that's the best of the bunch. But none of these are bad. Flipping over the back, and EA definitely got adventurous here with this layout, and I think for good reason, as unfortunately, LHX Attack Chopper is one of those games that is just not going to photograph well, due to its graphics, or lack thereof in places. Considering what the game actually looks like, I think they went with a good selection for the larger 4 pictures, and then showed off views of both the LHX and the Apache cockpits. More on that in a minute. But even with that, they're all somewhat grainy, certainly more so than I would expect in late 1992. The flavor text back here is fine, nothing too out of the ordinary, just your usual selling of the game, but there's one thing I've got to call out, and it's the selling of the most ridiculous feature in the game, and that's the 11 different camera angles that can be chosen, which is what these pictures at the bottom are for. Now, you might notice that these 4 pictures are particularly awful, and that's because that's how the game looks when you choose one of those alternate angles. I'll rant more about that further on, but I can't believe they tried to use this to sell the game. Opening up the case, and the manual is a tad worn, but fully intact. This is one of those classic Electronic Arts 64-page beasts, from when a manual was a manual. I've got to admit, at first I was a bit intimidated by this, and I even joked about having to read a 64-page manual to play the game on Twitter, but honestly, the game isn't that deep once you get past the slightly wonky control scheme. Most of what's here is just details about the game, really fleshing out everything, and even having a section at the back that details most of the equipment and the vehicles that you'll run into. I miss these days of manuals. Sure, you might not read it from cover to cover, but it's great to look at. Okay, that's the package. Let's start the review. LHX Attack Chopper. In 2023, when I'm doing this review, most people probably won't know what a LHX is. Hell, in the early 90s, when the game was originally released, probably most people didn't know what it was, and were more familiar with the name from this game than from the actual knowledge of the military. I certainly didn't know what it was before I started doing research for the review. But as it turns out, the story of the LHX is actually very similar to that of the F-22 Raptor that was the focus of the previously reviewed F-22 Interceptor. I believe I talked about it a bit in that review, but to refresh everyone's memory, the F-22 Raptor didn't actually exist in 1991 when the game was released. Instead, the game was simply based on the idea of the F-22, whose origins dated back to 1981, but in reality didn't take its first official flight until 1997. I'm not a military guy, so I don't know why EA thought it was a good idea to make a sim featuring equipment that didn't actually exist, but all I can guess is that perhaps there had been lots of hype for the F-22 in those circles around the time, so EA decided to take advantage of the futuristic idea of the jet. For all the delays in the very drawn-out process of building that fleet of F-22s, it at least became a real viable product for Lockheed Martin, and over the course of 14 years, they built 195 of the planes, with 8 being demo units and the rest allotted to the US military. the LHX Attack Chopper? Well, that's a bit of a different story. LHX stands for Light Helicopter Experimental, and despite its appearance in the game, it's not an actual helicopter, or chopper. Instead, LHX is the name for the program that the Army started in the 1980s to attempt to come up with a new helicopter design for their use, similar to how the F-22 was the result of the Air Force's Advanced Tactical Fighter program. This LHX program began in 1982 and originally featured two competing designs for the Army to choose from, one from Boeing Sikorsky and one from Bell McDonnell Douglas. Eventually, in 1991, the military chose Boeing Sikorsky for production, with the resulting vehicle being named the RAH-66 Comanche. By 1996, Boeing Sikorsky had a prototype ready to fly, and that was about it. Ultimately, only two of the helicopters were ever actually built, as the rapid changes to battlefield technology at the time required the designs of the helicopters to be altered, and ultimately the military decided it made more sense to simply retrofit its existing inventory of helicopters with similar equipment to what would have been put in the Comanche, with the project officially being scrapped in 2004. You might be wondering why EA titled the game LHX Attack Chopper instead of RAH-66 Comanche, since that model had been picked in mid-1991, well before the game was released on the Genesis. But remember that the Genesis version is actually a port, and the original LHX Attack Chopper was released for DOS computers in 1990. And seeing how even the prototypes of the RAH-66 didn't exist yet, it would have been splitting hairs to change the name at that point. Although, maybe they should have. You see, while the Genesis version is a port, it's missing two key features of the DOS version, namely, the ability to pilot two other helicopters, the UH-60 Blackhawk and the MV-22 Osprey, along with the included LHX prototype in the AH-64A Apache. When I first found out the Genesis version had the choice of the LHX or the Apache, I thought, oh wow, that's pretty cool. But then I found out that the other two helicopters were removed from the game for reasons that remain unclear, and well, it wasn't quite as cool. Okay, well, that's certainly enough of a military equipment history for this review. I think everyone should be up to speed by now. Let's start about talking about what you actually do in the game. Well, you're a helicopter pilot. Duh. And as a pilot, it's your job to navigate various battlefields around the world, and then take certain actions, with the most common one being to take out various strategic targets without being shot down. But then there's also some cargo transport mission objectives and personnel rescue missions mixed in as well. Ultimately, the game is broken down into 31 levels across 3 combat theaters around the globe, with the game starting out with a section in Libya and then progressing to Southeast Asia and finally Europe. Interestingly enough, apparently the original DOS version referred to the Southeast Asian and European missions specifically as taking place in Vietnam and Germany, but for some reason the Genesis version had that changed to the more generic geographical areas. I'm not really sure why that was, but on the last page of the manual, after the credits, there's a political disclaimer that reads like perhaps there have been some complaints on the DOS version, so possibly they decided to use more generic locations in the descriptions as a result. Honestly, it really doesn't matter, as the locations are really just an excuse to change up the weather and backgrounds in the levels. They could be anywhere that matches up, since this is all fictional anyway. To do your job as a pilot and navigate around the various maps, you've got to be able to control your chopper. I made a joke earlier in the week about having to read a flight manual to play the game, in reference to how big the game manual is, but in reality, it's not that complicated, and you'll probably have the ins and outs down after a mission or two. The one major problem with controlling the game is the fact that it was released before the 6-button controller, and as a result, EA had to get creative with things. The end result is that the start button is used as a function key toggle, essentially, and pressing start along with each of the D-pad directions and A, B, and C will produce a different result than if the start button was not pressed. Once you get used to this and learn which button combinations do what, it's fine, and it'll become second nature. Even if the game supported the 6-button controller that didn't exist yet, you'd still have the problem of just having a D-pad for a 3D game, And if you're having problems trying to visualize that, remember what it was like trying to play 3D games on the Nintendo 64 or the Dreamcast, but then throw in the need to gain or lose altitude as well. I've definitely been spoiled by dual analog thumbsticks over the years, that's for sure. Ultimately, I didn't have any problems with how the game controls, due to the fact that it moves pretty slow and that you can usually just pick an altitude and stay there for most of the level, but I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to just pick it up and play. There's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. Every level for each of the geographic regions takes place on the same map, which you can pull up during gameplay by hitting start. There's not a ton of reason to look at the map, unless you're trying to get an idea of which portions are controlled by whom, or maybe if your navigation system got knocked out by enemy fire, but it's still good to have, just in case. The navigation system can be your best friend, and your worst enemy, for that matter, but you'll still want to do what you can to avoid having it shot up. During gameplay, you'll flip back and forth between your targeting system and the navigation system periodically, as the maps can be somewhat large, or at least they feel that way due to the amount of time that you're going to spend moving from checkpoint to checkpoint. At full speed, your helicopter is covering in-game miles in a span of about 12 seconds, which is actually fast, but sometimes you'll be needing to travel 20 miles to get to a destination, so you'll need to buckle in for about a 4-minute ride, and that's assuming that you don't attack anything or get attacked on the way. The reason why I quipped that the navigation system could be your worst enemy is because it's kind of stupid. Frequently, levels will have a starting location, 1 or 2 target locations, and then an ending location, with sometimes the starting location and the ending location being the same airstrip, and then sometimes they're actually in different parts of the map. This is all well and good, and you can manually toggle between the location that's currently selected by hitting Start and A if need be. The problem is, the navigation system frequently will automatically update to the next location when it detects that you've reached the previous one, which is great in theory. However, oftentimes, usually you haven't completed your objective yet, so the computer will be telling you to go somewhere else before you actually should if you want to successfully complete your mission. Once you fail a few missions because you got confused about whether you actually did everything you were supposed to do, you'll figure out not to trust it necessarily. So it's not a game-breaking issue, but it can be annoying rather than helpful. As far as the actual missions go, they can be split into one of two types. Either you're going to be going to a location to blow up a target, or you're going to have to rescue people either by picking them up or dropping off supplies to them. The blow up crap missions are definitely my preferred type of mission, but I do appreciate the variety. The problem with the rescue type missions is that you're having to target either a specific location on the ground, which isn't marked, you just have to try to use the navigation system to get close, or pick up people from the ground that are waving at you, which of course requires you to kind of guess when you're over them, because you won't be able to see them from the cockpit when you get close enough to pick them up. Also, for both of those instances, you have to be hovering less than 20 feet in the air, which means you have to move around very slowly if you didn't descend in just the right place, or else you risk crashing. It sounds worse than it is, and I'm sure with practice, someone could probably get in and out of these situations a lot quicker, but from my experience, it slowed down gameplay considerably, which isn't really what you want. I mentioned in the package section previously that in fact the game had different camera angles available to use during gameplay, and those are chosen in the start menu with the area map by pressing up or down on the D-pad to select the next view. In theory, being able to choose these alternate views in a 3D game is a great idea, but in practice you'll end up right back in cockpit after cycling through all of them, as the game is incredibly difficult to play otherwise. You really need to be able to see that navigation and targeting screen, along with your radar and repping counts, not to mention the fact that most of the cameras aren't particularly good at showing where you and your targets actually are. The alternate camera angles would be a good option to have if there was an instant replay mode, and you wanted a more cinematic view of what was going on, but the game doesn't have that, so these modes will just be sitting there unused 99% of the time. This is probably a good time to segue into LHX Attack Chopper's graphics. If you played the aforementioned F-22 Interceptor, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what to expect, as I'm pretty sure that this game is running on the same engine. Unfortunately, they're not great, as you probably would expect, considering that the game is running on a Sega Genesis without any kind of supplemental 3D support. The Genesis simply wasn't designed with 3D graphics in mind, and its lack of hardware scaling and rotation features hurt it as well. As a result, you're going to spend your time piloting around in a game that runs at a few frames per second at best. And on top of that, all of the polygons are flat shaded, so for the Libyan missions in particular, I hope you like brown, as that's what the majority of your screen is going to be filled with. I'm sure plenty of people are going to see this game run for 15 seconds and immediately say that it's not for them due to the visuals, and that's totally understandable. But considering the situation and the fact that there really was no better option on home consoles at the time, as Star Fox was still months away, I think you have to give them credit for at least trying, even if the end result isn't very appealing. While I can give the designers a pass on the graphics due to the hardware just not being there, the sound is another question entirely. The Genesis can produce good sound, if it's handled correctly, but there's none of that here. The game has no background music, outside of a brief title screen fanfare, and most of the game is filled with the whooping sound of your helicopter blades, and some other relatively poor sound effects. There's no reason for enemy gunfire to sound like laser blasts, and yet here we are with LHX Attack Chopper doing its best Buck Rogers countdown to Doomsday impression. There's some speech thrown in occasionally for when you lock onto a target or complete certain mission objectives, but even that sounds horrible and very low sampled. All I can assume is that so much of the game is wrapped up in trying to display what's on screen, so that maybe there just weren't that many resources left over for playing sound files. But that's a huge assumption on my part, and I'm certainly not going to give them any credit for that like I did with the graphics. LHX Attack Chopper is a game that I liked more than I expected and has some nice touches of humor thrown in, like in some of the mission descriptions or the ability to blow up a camel. It's got a decent length, and with 31 levels, there's enough to keep you busy for a while. Unfortunately, once you've done a few of the attack missions or rescue missions, you've kind of seen all there is to see, so the action does get a little repetitive, especially the amount of time that you'll be spending just traveling from location to location. The Genesis version does at least bring over the Apache helicopter from the PC version, and choosing the Apache does change the gameplay in minor ways, so that's nice that they included it. And I like how the game has continued support via passwords, but it really would have been nice for them to include battery backup as well, so that you could save your score, rank, and medal progress. Also, the 2-player option is a nice feature with 1-player piloting and the 2nd player gunning, similar to Battletech, and that's a feature that F-22 Interceptor did not have. But even with those features and the overall decent gameplay, I just can't give LHX Attack Chopper anything higher than 2 stars, as the graphics are hard to look at and the sound is the pits. Military buffs will probably dig it, similar to F-22 Interceptor, but anyone else is probably good to skip it for more advanced titles.
And that was LHX Attack Chopper for the Genesis. I didn't hate my time playing this game, and I played it for probably about 4 or 5 hours for the review. Blowing up random crap is always fun, and I definitely enjoyed the ability to complete the primary directive for the mission, and then take out extra bogeys on the way back, assuming I didn't run out of gas. I think it probably would have been a bit more fun had it not been quite as much of a simulation, and not had the ammo and fuel limitations, but at the same time, I appreciate what they were going for, but it's definitely not going to be for everyone. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's a game that actually I should have reviewed a long time ago, and going by my games in a series every 100 episodes rule. I'm actually not sure how I messed that up, but there's actually a few games that I've dropped the ball on in this regard. For instance, I've never reviewed Road Rash or Super Off-Road for the Master System after doing the Genesis version. So hopefully I can fix that by getting both of those in sometime this year. Maybe I can ask my friend Kiryu for some help with next week's video though. I'm pretty certain he's played it at some point. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 187. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.